Bridges are something most of us take for granted. Most of us see them on a daily basis, from a small bridge over a little creek to larger engineering marvels that span several miles over lakes and rivers. They are an absolutely integral part of most people's everyday life. However, when these vital links of transportation fail, they bring death and destruction to those around it. Like during Australia's worst industrial accident when the Westgate Bridge collapsed during construction. So, what happened? I'm Andrew, and this is History's a Disaster. Tonight, we're jumping into the worst industrial accident in Australian history, the collapse of the Westgate Bridge. And tonight's episode is brought to you by the Concrete Gym. Are you tired of those boring old gyms with their old and lame free weights and broken machines that haven't been cleaned in months? Then come on down to the Concrete Gym. Lifting concrete is cheaper and easier than regular weights, and fun. On Tuesdays, we do Make Your Own Weights Day. Want to bench press 100-pound garden gnomes? How about curl 30-pound dog bones? Or maybe deadlifting a 200-pound horse? Well, on Tuesdays, we can make that dream a reality with our custom concrete molds. So come on down to Concrete Gym and get started on your concrete fitness journey today. Only $99.95 to start. Melbourne, Australia in the 1960s was booming. The port was, and still is, the busiest in Australia. The city was growing and evolving, but it had some problems. Immigration was up. People from all over were flocking to Australia, which is not necessarily a bad problem to have. But this influx of new people would need jobs to support their families in their new country. The other problem they had was the Yarra River that runs right through the heart of Melbourne. The river separated the western suburbs from the port and the industrial centers. At the time, the only real way from one side of the Yarra to the other was by ferry, which severely limited the flow of traffic of people and goods. So the best way to help fix all these little problems is with a new high-span bridge that'll connect both sides of Melbourne, as well as creating a lot of new construction jobs and helping Melbourne evolve into an even greater city. So in 1968, construction began on the Westgate Bridge. This was to be an 8-lane cable-stayed bridge with a box girder design, which meant that the actual roadway of the bridge would be made from large prefabricated box girder sections supported by large concrete pillars. The center of the bridge would have 2 huge towers that used large steel cables to add strength and stability to the longest central section of the bridge. And this would not be any sort of small bridge. When finished, it would be 8,500 feet long and stand nearly 200 feet tall, making it the 5th longest bridge in Australia, along with being one of the tallest. The British firm Freeman Fox and Partners, who were quite fond of saying they were the best in the world, which is a rather dubious claim, was hired to design the steel box sections of the bridge. A Dutch firm was brought in to design and make the large prefabricated concrete sections, and a local company was hired to build the concrete pillars as well as the on and off ramps. Getting a job on one of the crews was really pretty easy. If you had the guts to work at those heights, then you pretty much just had to show up and you had a job. Now remember, at this time, there wasn't much in the way of safety regulations. There was no OSHA, no Australian equivalent. Safe Work Australia wouldn't come about until 2019, and unions didn't have any legal standing in Australia. And there would be plenty of safety concerns brought up. The men working the bridge tried to start a safety committee, but the company wasn't having any of that. So they wouldn't fund it or do anything about the concerns they had. Concerns like how badly the bridge swayed during high winds, or how when they bolted a new section onto the bridge, the bolts would deform and bend when they had to take the weight off the new section. It also wasn't uncommon for bolts and rivets to break, sending the broken off head pinging throughout the structure. But the Lower Yarra Crossing Authority, the company actually building the bridge, didn't want to hear any of it. They just said they hired one of the best engineering firms in the world and everything was perfectly safe. And they would keep trying to push this line, but things finally came to a head when the work crews heard about a bridge with a similar design that collapsed in Wales and killed 4 people. They refused to work and went on strike. So, one of the lead engineers came down to talk to the guys, swearing how safe the bridge was and that he'd stake his life on how safe it was. However, the one thing the engineer failed to mention was they were the ones who built the bridge in Wales. But they managed to convince everyone to trust them and go back to work. Big mistake. Never trust an engineer. They normally sound great, on paper, but they don't know what the fuck they're talking about when it comes to real world shit. Like saying the Westgate Bridge was safe, despite it being under tremendous stress, and the whole thing really wasn't that stable. But still, they ended their strike and went back to work. Then Thursday, October 15th came, just 10 days after the strike ended. 2 of the large prefabricated steel sections were winched into place to join the span between piers 10 and 11. But when they got everything in place, the girders didn't quite line up right. One of them had a bit of a bend to it and sat 5 inches higher than the other. So, to fix the problem, they decided to just weigh it down with a bunch of cement blocks. Because, obviously, weighing shit down with concrete is the Australian answer to fixing engineering fuck-ups. See my episode on the Granville train wreck for more on that. So, they put 10 of these concrete blocks down, each of them weighing in at around 9 tons. Which did force the section to come down enough for both of them to be bolted together. The additional weight, however, put a greater strain on the span and caused the steel to buckle in places. So, to relieve this stress, they were told to undo some of the bolts. But instead of relieving the stress, it added even more in certain spots. So, after more than 30 bolts had been removed, a loud crack rumbled through the air as the bridge snapped in half. Men working on the bridge were thrown into the air. The concrete pillars supporting the bridge collapsed towards men on the ground. Metal screeched and twisted as cranes fell. Oxyacetylene tanks exploded, adding fire to the mix. A fire that would be fed by diesel fuel that was spilled all over the ground. 2,000 tons of steel and concrete slammed down in a V shape. The ground shook as it fell, part of it falling into the muddy Yarra River, sending a huge spray of mud to cover nearby houses and anything else in its path. The other part fell on construction huts directly beneath the bridge, crushing them and anyone still inside. The sound of the bridge falling could be heard for miles around. Survival again came down to pure dumb luck, being in the right place at the right time. There were nearly 70 people working on the bridge when it fell. Many were thrown into the river below, where the mud cushioned their fall from that height. A few were able to hold on for dear life and ride the broken bridge down. Others would not be so lucky. Alarm bells rang across the city as the call went out. Ambulances and rescue personnel from across the city raced to the construction site and were on scene quickly. Members of the Salvation Army, journalists, and priests followed closely in their wake. They worked relentlessly to pull the injured and dead from the wreckage. The injured were often had to be held back and restrained. Despite their injuries, they fought to keep going back to try to help their fallen coworkers. Everyone worked until they were exhausted, shifting the rubble and separating the injured from the dead, along with the even more grisly task of collecting body parts and attempting to sort what part belonged to who. Priests moved through the dead to administer last rites as paramedics worked on the injured. Ambulances were loaded up and ran back and forth to Royal Melbourne Hospital and others throughout the city. The dead were covered in sheets and lined up in the streets. They had no place to take them. The small but growing city of Melbourne just had no place for them to go. They were completely unprepared for a tragedy of this size. Tragically, 35 men were killed when the bridge fell, with another 18 seriously injured, and it would take days to clear the wreckage and recover all the bodies. While the rescue was going on, the coroner put together a technical committee. This committee consisted of professionals in engineering, building, metallurgy, and chemistry. They set out with the goal to preserve evidence and find out everything they could about the accident. To accomplish this, they visited the site over multiple days, interviewing engineers and witnesses, and digging through every shred of evidence they could find, from photographs to work diaries and drawings. And of course, in the wake of the collapse, there was no counseling of any type of support offered to survivors. They were just expected to carry on and come on back to work. They worked through the weekend and were finally given Monday off with pay. But when they came back to work Tuesday morning, they were all fired. No warning, no support. Just a week worth of pay and, well, we're done here. Thanks, have a nice life. The survivors were left to deal with the mental scars of what they had been through alone, along with now having to figure out how the hell they were supposed to support their families. The 28 widows would receive a widow's pension, but that didn't amount to too much, and any sort of compensation would be a long time coming. It would be the kindness of their fellow Australians sending in weekly donations that did the most to help out the families of the dead. Other survivors, despite their own hardships, were often throwing in their own donations to help the widows. Donations grew to a point they needed help with managing the funds coming in. The Citizens Welfare Service was brought in to determine how funds should be distributed. And of course, they fucked around and played favorites with this. They got judgy with the widows on how they were coping with things or what their house looked like. And, well, fuck them if they didn't speak good enough English. So the poorest of them, the ones that needed it the most, the regular workers, received partial payments of around $36 a week. Meanwhile, the wives of the engineers and foremen got a more substantial payout of $100 a week, which, yeah, that sounds totally fair. So they were all left to struggle. Meanwhile, for 2 years, the bridge sat unfinished, a constant reminder of the tragedy hanging in the air. But eventually, new engineers were brought in to finish the job. Some of the original crew just couldn't bring themselves to go back to work. The memories were just too painful to bear. Others felt they had to go back. They had to finish what they started, not just for themselves, but for the memory of those who died. Construction finally resumed and the bridge was completed in 1978. The day it was finally completed, the original plan was to have a government official be the first to cross the completed bridge. But after some pushback from the work crews, it was decided that one of them would be the first to cross, something that would later be memorialized and sung by the band The Cobbers, an Australian folk band. Following the collapse, the Royal Commission into the failure of the Westgate Bridge was headed up by Mr. Justice Barber. The commission met for 6 months, beginning on October 28, 1970, and ran until July 14th of 71. Over 73 days of hearings in which 52 witnesses spent countless hours testifying and being subjected to examination and cross-exam, along with over 300 articles of evidence like photos and legal documents that had to be gone through. And just over a month after the final testimony, the commission released its findings in a detailed 300-page report, which was brought before the Victorian Parliament on August 3rd. The report placed blame on critical failures in design, construction methods, and flawed attempts to correct a structural issue. They found no one involved in the construction blameless. The report concluded with, "The disaster which occurred and the tragedy of the 35 deaths was utterly unnecessary. That it should have been allowed to happen was inexcusable. There was no sudden onslaught of natural forces, no unexpected failure of new or untested material. The reasons for the collapse are to be found in the acts and omissions of those entrusted with building a bridge of a new and highly sophisticated design. The various companies who supplied the materials used were not shown to be in any way at fault and must be held blameless. However, among those engaged upon the design and construction of the steel spans, there were mistakes, miscalculations, errors of judgment, failure of communication, and sheer inefficiency. In greater or less degree, the authority itself, the designers, the contractors, even the labor engaged in the work must all take some part of the blame." So they really stuck it to everyone in this. This disaster would go on to change the balance of the industrial landscape in Australia. Unions were able to push for stronger roles in safety negotiations, mandatory occupational health and safety committees, and mandatory site inspections involving worker representatives. Safety training, incident reporting, and grief counseling also became highly important parts of workplace management. These reforms would go on to put an end to the era of safety being optional and disregarded. Countless lives have surely been saved since these changes went into effect. 6 twisted fragments of the collapsed bridge now sit in the Westgate Garden at the engineering facility of Monash University's Clayton campus. The university picked them up after being asked to help out in the investigation. They now stand as a sobering reminder of what can happen when engineers fail. Every year since the collapse, memorials celebrating the loss have been held on October 15th. A Westgate Bridge Memorial Park is now located near the bridge. It opened on October 15, 2004, the 34th anniversary of the collapse. It includes the Westgate Bridge Memorial and Sculpture, and the memorial for 6 who died in the Spotswood Sewer Tunnel collapse of April 12, 1895. And just a little bit about this bridge. When it was first built, it was designed as an 8-lane highway meant to handle 200,000 vehicles a week. But in the following decades, the bridge has been expanded out to 10 lanes and now sees over 1 million vehicles crossing it in a week, which just shows how much Melbourne has grown and changed in the intervening decades. And that was the Westgate Bridge disaster. Thanks for listening. And if you like the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice. And you can always reach out to the show at historiesofdisaster@gmail.com with questions, comments, or suggestions, as well as following the show on social media like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, whatever. And share the episode. Your friends will love it. And remember, while taking your penguin out for a walk to get some exercise is a pretty good idea, what they really love is sliding around on their bellies. So maybe next time, skip the walk and get out the old slip and slide and let them have their fun sliding around the backyard. So, chase that dream. Live for today, 'cause tomorrow is never guaranteed. Thanks and goodbye.